Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. The word of the Lord.
Hey, good morning. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here, and over the last few weeks in this season, we've actually been in a message series in the book of James. Now, James, as we've been talking about, is actually written from one of the early apostles or the leaders or the founders of the church movement after Jesus resurrects from the grave. And James is one of the church leaders who ends up bringing the message of Jesus around the world, even as a minority kind of religion that not many people knew about. There was this Jesus person who was this carpenter. Now, one of the things that gives James such authority and power was not only the fact that he was an apostle who was sent as one of the early leaders of the church, but also that he grew up with Jesus. He was Jesus' brother or half-brother. He was someone then who saw and witnessed who Jesus was behind closed doors. In many ways, he's someone that had an eyewitness account in the truest sense of someone who yet he claims to follow Jesus and calls Jesus Lord, as we talked about when we began this message series. Now, today we actually conclude this message series. We finally made it to the end of the book of James. And one of the things that we've been reflecting on, especially as it relates to this letter that James was writing to the early church, is just how fundamentally practical it is. We talked about how many people, they actually categorize the book of James in wisdom literature. In other words, there's things that James has to write that anyone, no matter what your religious disposition or background might be, you can somewhat relate to. So to give you some background, check this out. Look at this list of where we've been. We talked about trials and temptations and how do we approach those trials that come to our lives. Listening and doing and being people with integrity, that we not only listen, but we also actually put into practice the things that we say we believe. We talked about equality, how favoritism within kind of from a Christian perspective, favoritism is not to be part of God's family, and equality is the way of God's people. We talked about faith and deeds, why our words matter. We talked about true wisdom and humility, your money and what we do with our money, as well as cultivating patience. That's kind of where we left off. Now, if you notice, no matter what you've walked in here with, any of these topics, hopefully you've walked in and you look at these topics and you're like, that sounds like a very Christian thing. I knew that that's what Christians want to talk about all the time. Well, what I would beg for you to consider is that if you were to reflect on any of these things, like what we do with our trials and difficulties, that is not distinctly a Christian problem. Like how we treat one another with favoritism being forbidden, that is not uniquely Christian. That's actually just a fundamental human problem. It's an issue that human beings, all of us, despite wherever we live, wherever we grew up, what background, how much income we make, all of us wrestle through issues of life about how can we become more patient? What do we do with our money? How do we treat people who are different than us? And so in many ways, the book of James is incredibly accessible because everything that James is writing about is really an invitation for us when it comes to, if you're a human being here, any human beings, just raise your hand. Some of you didn't, a little troubled by that, but nonetheless. Now look at how James is gonna end. So he's ending this entire teaching that he's given on these fundamentally very human kind of elements that we all kind of wrestle with throughout life. He ends it, and notice what he does. He asks these questions. He says, is anyone among you in trouble? Is anyone happy? Is anyone among you sick? Now, he's asking these questions. Now, I mean, I love how he's finishing this, right? Because here's what he's doing, right? He's saying, is anyone in trouble? And now I imagine some people, like even if I were to ask this room, is anyone here in trouble? Yes, the baby right there just said yes, right? Like I believe some of us, when it comes to the different areas of our lives, whether it's relationships or whether it's work or illness, or the Yankees lost to the Dodgers yesterday, like whatever it might be, like some of us, we're in trouble and we think about it and we reflect on it. Now, all of a sudden, he's asking this rhetorical question, is anyone in trouble? Or is anyone happy? Now, notice how he swung from one side to the next, one side of the pendulum to the next. Is anyone sick? Now, all of these questions, the idea behind James, why is he asking these questions to start out this concluding portion of his letter? And why? Because when he's asking this question, if I were to ask this question of this group, is anyone in trouble? Is anyone happy? Is anyone sick? The reality is most of us, because we're human, we would all raise our hands to respond to at least one of these questions. Now, why is he asking these rhetorical questions? Because just like the rest of the book of James has fundamentally been about the human experience. Again, whatever religious background you come from, wherever you are in your relationship with God, maybe you just came here because you wanted to meet a friend here and they begged you to come to church. Whatever it was, wherever you are in your spiritual journey, there's been these human moments for you and I that we all go through. And he's asking this question because he's ending it with the very same principle that what I'm about to say relates to everyone. Now, notice how James actually answers these rhetorical questions. Check this out. He says, is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. Now, here's where the distinctly Christian message about what we do as human beings when it relates to life comes in, right? Because one would think, even as you reflect on that list of trials and temptations, favoritism, and being forbidden, and what we do with our money, like most people, like again, we could all, whatever background we come from, we could all read that list. And some of us could go to the self-help section over at a bookstore and be able to pick out books or topics that relate to any one of these things, including the questions of, is anyone in trouble? Is anyone happy? Is anyone sick? Like, it's easy to answer those questions. You don't even have to be a Christian and be like, yes, yes, yes. Well, let them do whatever. Now, here's where James is bringing in a very distinct Christian way of approaching life, the experiences that we go through as human beings. And fundamentally, what he points to is, he says, let them pray. Let them sing songs of praise. Let them call forth others, elders in the church, to come and pray over us. James is ending this section, this wisdom literature, with the distinct news of what it means to be a Christian, and that's to pray. Prayer, in other words, when it comes to like, when should we be praying? This practice of prayer. When and where do we practice it? But you see, he's asking these rhetorical questions of when you're sick, when you're in trouble, when you're happy. In any of these moments, we are invited to a life of prayer. Why? Because prayer is actually a way of life. And in fact, in the letter to the church in Thessalonica, there's a passage that says, pray without ceasing. There's this invitation to pray without ceasing. Now, why is this invitation there? The invitation to pray in any of life's circumstances, it's an invitation that we as Christians, what we believe is that life isn't fundamentally about you and me trying to figure out life on our own or trying to use our own ingenuity, smarts, wits, background, money, financial provision to use everything at our disposal for ourselves. Life is also not fundamentally about relying on a community to discern for us. Now, not to say that any of these things are bad things, to come up with a direction for myself, by myself, nor is it wrong to go to community. In fact, the scriptures talk about all of these things being helpful for finding God's will. But fundamentally, everything, whether it's my own inclinations, desires, hopes, and dreams, or the discernment of a community around me, all of this fundamentally is subsumed under what? It's under a disposition that's willing in every circumstance of life to submit to God in prayer. Because what he's inviting us to is to have a life where our real day-to-day lives is not simply a life that's void of God, but instead it's actually a life that is incredibly immersed in a Godward disposition. That as I go about my days, whether I'm sick or in trouble or happy, whatever I'm doing, that somehow I'm living in light of the reality of a God who is in control above me and beyond me. Now, here's the thing. For most of us, though, we've been trained, even in the church, to just ignore God, or maybe just to give God maybe just 1 hour a week on Sundays, or 45 minutes if you tune out during the sermon, or 30 minutes if you come out and tune yourself out during the sermon, whatever it might be, if you come late. This is how we've been trained. And yet, here's what James is saying. See, all of us, all of life is to be this approach to life in which we live a life of prayer. What does that mean, that prayer is a way of life? It means that I constantly live life aware of God and in light of who God is. It's kind of like I'm married to my wife, Tina, and my marriage is, I'm so deeply committed to my marriage. But the reality is we're separate people. Tina and I are separate people. In a couple of months, I'm actually gonna go visit my family in Los Angeles, California, and I'm gonna be with them. I'm going on my own because Tina and the kids have some other things that they're gonna be doing in New York. Now, when I go to California, while I'm in California, I'm still thinking and pondering about Tina. And because I'm thinking and pondering her, I'm living in light of the fact that I'm married to her. And so as a result, I'm thinking about that informs the way that I'm gonna interact with other people, who I'm gonna hang out with, what I'm gonna do when I get back. I'm thinking about ways that hopefully I can make life a little bit easier for her while she's the one kind of with our kids at the time. Like, does that make sense? So in other words, what prayer is this, it's a way of life in which I'm constantly living aware of God's presence and God's direction, God's desires, as well as my commitment to God. It doesn't matter where I go, I live with that reality. Now, here's one way that I thought today that modern people can often answer this question, right? Is anyone among you in trouble? Is anyone happy? Is anyone among you sick? Some of us, we come from the mantra, well, let them work harder. That's how we answer that question. It's not pray first, it's just work harder. Let them make more money, because money can solve all of our issues. Until more money, more problems. Let them binge watch Netflix. I'm in trouble. I just need to go and then binge watch Netflix, and that'll make me feel better until I feel gross. Let them grab a drink. I just need to hit that happy hour, or I just can't wait to get another drink. Let them scroll through social media. Because I don't want to reflect or deal with some of the issues in my life. I'd rather just scroll through social media. Rather watch pornography and just kind of numb myself so that I don't have to really confront life and wrestle with life. Let them take it out on your family. I don't know what to do to manage this, so what I do is I try to hold it all together until I'm with my family, and then they get the worst parts of me. Or I take them out on your coworkers. And so in many ways, the invitation then of life, we simply live a life void of prayer or of a Godward kind of mentality. Instead, we're living like everyone else in the world around us with an approach to life that is anything but prayerful or a way of life. There's actually a missiologist from Malawi who teaches at a university in Liverpool in the UK, Dr. Harvey Kwiyani. And check out what he writes about. He says this, he says, I grew up in a revival in Malawi, the kind of revival that turned many nominal Christians into fervent followers of Christ, ever ready to pray and evangelize. I saw many people miraculously convert by themselves because of dreams and other spectacular phenomena. Central to all this revival is a theology shaped by an African worldview that requires that God acts for and on behalf of people. Even in African traditional religion, a God who does not heal or provide is useless and will have no followers. Why would one follow a God who cannot protect people from the evil forces? The God of Israel that we see in the Bible is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides, Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals or restores, and Jehovah Sabaoth, the God of armies. A God whose only promise to humans is eternal life in heaven does not make sense. Yet such is the God that many other Christians worship, especially in the post-Enlightenment West. In other words, New York City. Many people profess to follow Christ, yet they live as if they are atheists. They are functional atheists. They are Christians, yet they are so self-sufficient that they do not need help from God. They live out their faith as if everything depends on them, their intelligence, credit cards, work ethic, technology, etc. Many do not have space to receive from God, even if God forces a gift on them. What a prophetic word to many of us. How many of us, we're just so smart, we're just so learned, we're just so rich, we're just so New York. Prayer is not the priority, it's actually an afterthought. And what if the invitation for all of us is to have the priority of where God stands in our life begin to make a marked difference in your life and in mine? See, the invitation of the Christian life, and even James, as he's talking about these fundamentally very human topics, he says, see, what makes it distinctly Christian is the invitation that wherever you are in life, you're in trouble, you're happy, you're sick, whatever it might be, let the invitation that you and I, our initial response is prayer. That prayer is a way of life. That we don't assume that we know it all, but instead that we surrender. Anne Lamott, who's one of my favorite authors, she actually wrote a book that I love. And it's a book called Help, Thanks, Wow. 3 essential prayers for everyone as a human being. Now, one of the reasons why I love these 3 words is because notice each of these 3 words are fundamental to the human experience. We all do this at times, whether you're a Christian or you're not. There's the moment, right, where you're running late and you run down to the subway and you're hoping the subway is there so you can make whatever you have on time, and then the subway comes right as you're entering into the turnstile or whatever, and then all of a sudden you're like, thank you. And you're not even a Christian and you're like, who are you saying thank you to? I don't know. It's just thank you to the universe, whoever it might be. We have these moments of great thanks. Or we have these moments, right? You've been there. You didn't study for the test last night. Don't know what to do. So the very last resort, you're like, hey, to the universe, can you just please help me, God? Or maybe you did study and you're still offering up prayers. I mean, help, thanks, and wow. There are these moments of just kind of like beauty or splendor that, again, these are fundamentally human experiences. And what Lamott says is basically these are actually prayers, the most fundamental ways that we can pray. Here's what she writes. She says, if I were going to begin practicing the presence of God for the first time today, it would help to begin by admitting the 3 most terrible truths of our existence: that we are so ruined and so loved and in charge of so little. What does it look like for each one of us as human beings to recognize this? We're so ruined, so loved, and in charge of so little. Maybe the invitation is for you not to ignore your humanity, but to actually live into your humanity even more. Wherever you are in the religious journey or the spiritual journey, what if the invitation for you was not the invitation, hey, you got to do all these religious, super spiritual practices, but what if it was an invitation for you to be more human than you've ever been before? To be a person who's able to simply say help, thanks, and wow. But to do it now, not to the universe or some kind of ethereal being, but to actually do it the God of heaven and earth who has revealed himself in the person of Jesus. Now, this is what James is saying. This is why the exhortation is, hey, if you're sick, if you're happy, if you're in trouble, pray. Look to the God of the heavens who created all things, who sent Jesus, his son. Would you look to this God? Now, look at what James writes further. He says, and the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other. In other words, if you live in light of this, if you live with prayer as a way of life, confess to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Now, some of you read this and you're like, this seems too formulaic. What in the world? How could James say this? How could he say every single time that you pray that this will happen, that you will be forgiven, that you will be healed? Well, notice for James, there's other moments in the book of James, in the letter of James, where he gives room for the fact that there's trials and difficulties. And there's ways that God doesn't answer the way we want him to. But nonetheless, he's still giving this exhortation. Why? Because again, he was someone who lived and grew up with Jesus. So he knew Jesus. He knew that living in light of who Jesus was, that God was a God who was attentive, that was there, that would ultimately be one who answers. Now, what church history actually tells us is this James, who was the leader of the early church, James would actually die by being stoned to death. Now, some of you are like, oh my goodness, like really? That guy's the guy who's writing this with such a heart and a guarantee that God is gonna come through? Yes, James believed this with all of his heart. Why? Because he saw Jesus resurrect from the grave. So he knew that whatever earthly trouble or difficulty that would come in his life, there was a God on the other side who had such a guarantee of hopefulness, of love, of compassion, that whatever circumstance he found himself in, he could offer up these prayers, and that God was a good God. Notice what James writes. He gives this example. He says, Elijah was a human being, even as we are. Notice he's giving this example of a human being who, yes, did supernatural things and saw signs and wonders, saw God move in all these incredible ways, and yet Elijah was a human being. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again, he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. Now, I remember reading this and being like, yes, be like Elijah. And then I was like, wait, he prayed for 3.5 years for something? Like, come on, it's hard enough for me to pray for 3.5 minutes. See, but he gives this response about someone who's able to pray in faith. It's not just this one and done, flash in the pan kind of way. It's actually trusting in the goodness of God in such a manner that whatever might be on your heart, whatever anxieties that you might be holding for your children, for a mental health issue, for an illness, for a job situation, for your future, for that finding that future, whatever it might be, whatever is on your heart, that you would be someone who your initial response is not trying to take things into your own hands and do things to fix things on your own, but instead to be a person who's dependent in prayer. See, because prayer is not simply a way of life. Prayer is dependence. It's willing to depend on a higher power. It's saying, God, I've come to the end of my rope. I trust that I am a human being just like Elijah, and I need you. With whatever befalls, I need you, God. Now, do you see how this is a distinctly Christian point of view? Because it's saying, will you trust, will you depend on God rather than yourself, rather than your mental acumen? Now, this does not mean, hey, you leave your brain at the door, you leave your rational thinking and all your gifts and talents. In fact, use those gifts and talents. But ultimately, will those be subsumed under this belief that God is the one who's God, who's in control, and as a result, I can have a prayerful disposition before this God? That is the invitation. Yesterday, for out of nowhere, my daughter Avery, she's 8 years old, and she's like, we were actually taking the ferry down to South Street Seaport and walking around and stuff with her brother and his cousin, and so I was taking them, and while we're waiting in line, all of a sudden my daughter says to me, Appa, let's do a trust fall. And I was like, a trust fall? Like, and for a moment, I didn't know what she was talking about. She goes, you know, when like you're behind me and then I fall back into your arms. I was like, oh, like where did you learn that? And she goes, you taught me that when I was 3. No, I'm just kidding. She didn't say that. But she said, you taught me that. And I was like, I couldn't even remember when I taught her that. And so here we are. We're on the pavement waiting in line, and she's like, okay, let's do a trust fall. And, if you've ever done this trust fall, or the idea behind it is you trust the person behind you. And so blindly, you're willing to fall into their arms. And so Avery, here she goes. She's doing it, and she's basically getting ready. And of course, the first time she does it, she kind of stumbles back, and she's trying to get the hang of it. And again, I don't remember ever doing this with my daughter before. But then she says to me, she goes, oh yeah, she's trying to figure out how to do it. And I said to her, Avery, to do it, you actually have to lose control. You've got to lose your center of gravity, and you just. Don't worry, I'm not going to do it. Everyone's like, oh my goodness, what's he going to demonstrate here? You have to depend truly. You just have to lose your center. And you have to entrust your center to me. And so she did it. She got so excited, she did it again. The third time I was like, okay, that's enough. You got it. I think you got it. You got the idea. A trust fall. Because prayer is dependence. It's entrusting ourselves. But look at how James ends the book. Look what he writes. He says, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back. Because here's what happens, right? We get carried away with life. Troubles, illnesses, jobs, bosses, difficulties. If one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this, whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. He ends with this. He ends this portion on prayer when he's talking about, gosh, if you can in some ways lose yourself, lose your center, if you can begin to pray in such a manner, it will actually save you from death and cover over a multitude of sins. And he ends with this exhortation for return, because prayer is not only a way of life, it's not only a way of dependence, it's also a way of return, of returning to a God, of losing your center and returning to the one who's ultimately in control, who's always had your life, your dreams, your hurts, your trauma, your woundedness, your anxieties, who's always had them in his hands. See, Jesus comes into the world to demonstrate to you and I that the God of the universe is not some distant God who is uncaring for you and whatever you're going through. In fact, Jesus comes into the world to actually beckon you home, to call you to return, to remind you that whenever you feel like you're at the end of your rope, or even when you don't feel like you're at the end of the rope, everything's going well, you're making a lot of money, you're living it up in New York City, and yet for whatever reason, there's the grace of God that has led you here to this room right now, so that maybe you could be welcomed home again. Ronald Rolheiser, he has this quote in his book, A Holy Longing. And this is what he writes. He writes, in this life, all symphonies remain unfinished. Our deep longings are never really satisfied. What this means, among other things, is that we are not restful creatures who sometimes get restless, fulfilled people who sometimes are dissatisfied, serene people who sometimes experience disquiet. Rather, we are restless people who occasionally find rest, dissatisfied people who occasionally find fulfillment, and disquieted people who occasionally find serenity. We do not naturally default into rest, satisfaction, and quiet, but into their opposite. I mean, isn't that the story of New York? Isn't this the story of how most of us live? We start running after these things. We pursue our career, this relationship, more money, that advancement. And yet there's this rumbling within the soul, this disquiet that still exists. Here's what Jesus writes, or says rather, that Matthew writes. Matthew writes, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. The God of the universe says, have you been trying to do things on your own? Have you been thinking that you're strong enough? Today, will you return? Will you say again, God, I need you? I need you. Before anything else and anyone else, I want to look up. I want to depend on you. I want to lose my center and entrust myself to you.